Thank you, Adam. You also forgot Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. That was woking as well. Right, some of you may have been in the audience 2 years ago when I came here as the CEO of the London Climate Change Agency. And shortly after that, I was asked to assist how we could actually deliver Sustainable Sydney 2030. And I established a blueprint in December 2008. So what you're going to see tonight is the journey of 2 years and just how quickly a city like Sydney, if it's really got some oomph behind it and wants to actually deliver something, just what can be achieved. First, I'll start with climate change and the reason why we're here to do this. What you see up there is a coal-fired power station. We've already heard statistics around that. I'm going to give you a different set of statistics. Climate change, I haven't got any complex Al Gore type charts. This shows you a typical 1,000 megawatt coal-fired power station, and that generates 1 million kilowatt hours of electricity per hour. It also generates more than 2 million kilowatt hours of heat per hour, and it uses something like 5 million litres of water per hour to throw away that heat. At the same time, it's emitting more than 1,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide per hour. And for those of you who don't know what a tonne of carbon dioxide looks like, it's a sphere 30 metres in diameter, about the same size as a hot air balloon. So 1,000 of those hot air balloons of carbon dioxide going up per hour. You multiply that by the 8,760 hours that we have in a year, and you can multiply that by the number of power stations you have in Australia, or indeed the world. And there you get a true picture of what climate change is about. It's much more easier to understand from this point of view. It is just not credible that climate change hasn't happened and that it's not man-made. You'll see in the primary cause of it now. So, when we look at power stations, it's just the laws of physics. When you generate electricity by thermal means, you typically generate twice the amount of heat that you do electricity. This gives you the efficiency of power stations. The red blob on the side is the 100% fuel. From coal, we get 36%, from nuclear, 38%, and from gas, 46%. Putting all that together, you'll see that there's more than a 2/3 loss. We lose further energy on the grid, getting the electricity from the Hunter Valley to Sydney. And so you've got less than a third of primary energy that's been burnt at the power station. And then we do some stupid things with it, like use electricity for air conditioning and heating and hot water, which we could have used the waste heat for. We've seen these figures before. Australia as a whole is going to be spending something like $45 billion on network upgrades right across Australia, which is actually bigger than the broadband network debate that we had. And yet we didn't hear anything about this at all during the recent election. Some work has been done on this, and this just gives you a picture of where your electricity bill is coming from and why it's gone up so much. The slice at the bottom is energy. You then got transmission and distribution costs, and then you've got retail. At the moment, your network costs are about 50% of your electricity bill, and that's due to rise to 60% by 2013. And on a business-as-usual scenario, there'll be another 5-year determination with more increased costs in network and so on. And I just wonder, on a business as usual, how far do we get? 70%, 80%, 90%, 99%? At what point do we say this isn't very efficient? I can't think of any other commodity that would spend so much on transmission getting a commodity from A to B. UTS have done some work on this, and they show that if decentralised energy could cut bills by $600 million a year, and say $1.4 to $3.8 billion in capital investment, and reduce emissions by between 2.2 and 8.4 million tonnes by 2020. We come to Sydney. You've already heard that the target in Sustainable Sydney 2030 is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 70% by 2030. And that's going to be made up of a number of measures. And some of you will have seen this before, what we call the waterfall chart. And by far the biggest chunk there is what's called green transformers. Now, green transformers is a combination of tri-generation, waste treatment, and water recycling. I'll come on a bit more detail in a moment. The biggest chunk of that, of course, is tri-generation. We're doing this at two levels. We're doing this at the city-wide level, so that's the whole of the City of Sydney, and also at an organisation level. In other words, putting our own house in order, show by doing, by accelerating the take-up of projects. The Green Infrastructure Plan, which is the name given to the blueprint that I established just under 2 years ago, and that's made up of 5 main master plans. Tri-generation, which is by far the biggest and on which the other green infrastructure can piggyback on. Renewable energy, alternative waste treatment, using waste as a resource, not to burn it or bury it, but can actually convert waste into renewable gases, and also recover water from waste, which is much needed on a continent like Australia. The Decentralised Water Master Plan, we've just had tenders back on that, and we're currently evaluating that. And the Automated Waste Collection System will be out to tender later this year. The tri-generation, on the other hand, as you've already heard, if we generate electricity locally, we can recover that heat, we can heat buildings, we can provide hot water services, and through a technology called heat-fired absorption cooling, we can convert the hot water to chilled water for air conditioning and refrigeration. Typical efficiency, instead of being under a third, is now up to about 85%. You can even actually achieve far higher percentages. The most efficient tri-generation system in the world is Avidor in Denmark, which achieves 93% efficiency. The oldest tri-generation system in the world, and the largest, is Manhattan. Edison first put that in 1882, and that's how Manhattan has kept pace with increasing energy loads. There are examples of cogeneration and tri-generation in Australia, or indeed in Sydney, for single systems for standalone buildings, typically designed to cover the base load or just the landlord's load. And so emissions savings are possible there. Green Star ratings can be applied to those types of projects. But you get far higher levels of emissions reductions and energy efficiency by combining buildings together. This is how it's done elsewhere. This is how it's done in Europe. It's how it's done in Asia. It's how it's done in North America. And that's simply because at different times of the day, you can balance energy loads out, and we can typically get 4, sometimes 5 times the amount of energy efficiency and emissions reduction than you could get with a standalone boiler in a basement tri-generation system. Yes, I really did used to recover the hot air in the council chamber in Woking. We're now moving on to the work. This report will be published later this year, but we've done enough of this report to actually report this to you. The City of Sydney has excellent floor and employment survey data, probably the best I've seen anywhere in the world. And that's enabled us to look at how the electricity is distributed and supplied to those buildings. Kinesis Consortium is the consultant that has drafted this report, and that comprises Kinesis, Origin Energy, and tri-generation proponent. We've also had Energy Australia, who's given us excellent technical detail that's enabled us to give a really detailed picture of how the energy is distributed throughout Sydney. Similarly, on gas, we've also done the same thing, and that's enabled us to look at the heating and hot water services. Particularly important, though, is looking at the heating and cooling loads, particularly the cooling loads, which for some buildings can be 60% of their electricity bill. And extracting that data, reducing that from the electricity consumption of the city, and then supplying that with thermal energy, either heating directly or cooling via absorption chilling, which is where the term tri-generation comes from. We've also been able to identify the most energy-dense parts of the city. No surprises there, the CBD. And instead of just a few megawatts here, we're actually talking significant amounts of tri-generation. We've looked at the 4 energy-dense areas in the CBD, CBD North, CBD South, Barangaroo, and Piermont and Broadway, and also at Green Square, another 20 megawatts there. These are in addition to the existing tri-generation systems. They're in addition to the tri-generation that we're currently tendering for, and it's also in addition to the recently approved tri-generation project at Global Switch 2, which is about 38 megawatts. So we're on our way, but this is by far a seismic change, moving from where we are today to where we need to be in the future. And when we look at developments like Green Square, you can begin to see how we can provide tri-generation, but one of those locations will also be a green transformer location where we can combine water treatment for the citywide recycled water network and also the receiving station for the automated waste collection. We looked at 24 different ways of doing tri-generation in the city. We looked at how that was done elsewhere in the world, from in Europe and parts of America, where you have a district heating network, but distribute your absorption chillers in buildings or groups of buildings. We've looked at separate heat and chilled water, and we've also looked at chilled water only, as they do it in Dubai, because they only have a need for air conditioning over there. We boiled that down to 9 runners, and of those 9 runners, 3 that actually stood out in terms of emissions reductions and economics. So a significant amount of work has gone into this, and this shows you the pace of carbon emissions reduction. These are large systems, and so they will take longer to build. Smaller scale systems can be built within the next 2 years, but probably the first really big ones will be completed around about 2015. And you'll see that we're now moving on a path between 40 and 60% reduction in CO2 emissions. What was the reason for the difference? Well, the 40% represents the economic approach to that. 60% is where we could get to if the regulatory barriers were removed or if there was a carbon price or something of that nature. The plant will do both, so it's not as if we're under-designing these things, it's just how it's operated, how it's run will determine how many tonnes of CO2 that would reduce. We've also looked at the economics of the project. We've looked at the capital costs, and we've discounted that back to 2010. And we see that the capital costs can pretty much be financed by the private sector. That's something like $420 million for capital costs. We've also looked at the operational costs, that's maintenance, operation, gas, and so on. And then what's left is the economics of the project. And there's something like a shortfall of about $45 million, which if you divide it by 20 years, you can see that it's a relatively small amount of money per annum. That doesn't necessarily have to be a subsidy. That could be something like an infrastructure levy charge. A carbon price could pick that up in future years. And so this is a very economic project. And when we compare that to what else we could do in terms of carbon abatement, you'll see that energy efficiency is number 1 still. That's what we'd expect. If you don't consume the energy in the first place, you don't have to supply it. But tri-generation, number 2, ahead of wind farms. Gas-fired power stations, halfway up the list. Black coal with carbon capture and sequestration. Fantasy of carbon capture and sequestration, the most expensive way of reducing emissions. And certainly a lot more than tri-generation. And then, for those of you not familiar what these look like, these are large-scale systems, the kind of things you see in Europe and the US, and now even in Asia. Singapore has such a system. Absorption chillers, if you've never seen what one looks like, they're static devices. Hot water goes in, chilled water comes out. And again, when we're talking about district heating networks or thermal networks, they are literally infrastructure under the road. And doing this gives us the opportunity to put the other pipes in for a citywide water recycling system and automated waste collection. Now, we tried how we could present what emissions look like. So this is the city, pretty much as today. So this is 2006, and gone up a bit since then. And we've modelled the density of emissions to the height of the buildings and what they consume. Some buildings, even though they're quite tall buildings, are a bit more efficient than other buildings. Some buildings, one building in particular, goes completely off the scale. And that shows you where we're at. That's a real graphical illustration of where the problem is. And so it makes sense for the city to concentrate on those energy-dense areas, those high-carbon areas, which we want to turn into low-carbon zones. We also looked at what federal government was doing, what state government was doing, the renewable energy target, 30%, and all the other efficiency measures. And we found that that was just really keeping pace with growth, and it wasn't much different to what it was in 2006. So this is just not going to get us anywhere near our target, even with a 30% renewable energy target. However, with tri-generation, of substantial reduction in emissions. We've still got that rogue building, it's still off the scale. They've come down a bit, but we put this in proportion, so without the rest of it looked very tiny if we'd have tried to match that. So that shows you the huge reduction in emissions, as I said before, between 40 and 60% reduction in CO2 emissions. And so that's low carbon zones are not theoretical lines on the map, they're actually designed around the energy network in the city, so that's where we have to do our technical calculations to make sure we have the right proportions of energy, both electricity, heating and cooling. And we've given them names, but they could be called almost anything. Moving on to renewable energy, that's another one of our master plans. And here, you've heard that trigeneration is going to deliver about 70%, renewable energy is going to deliver about 30%. But when I put this master plan out to tender, it wasn't just electricity. This shows all the electricity technologies, which some of you will be familiar with. We also looked at, similar to what I did in London, as to what we could derive from renewable gases. When I did this in London, we found that all of the waste that was going to landfill, not just municipal and commercial waste, but also agricultural, forestry, sewage, you name it, or everything that was being thrown away, we captured as a resource. And we found that if all of that was converted to renewable gases, it would supply more than 2 million homes in London. That's more than half of the 3.85 million homes that we actually have in London. It was actually our largest renewable energy resource. And so this work is still underway, but we've done enough. We can now see where this picture is going. Just to explain the map in front of you, which is a renewable energy resources map, this is electricity. There's significant onshore wind resource, solar thermal concentration further out, they're the things that look like suns. Offshore, wind farms, marine technologies, wave, tidal, and the red stuff is geothermal. So actually cities, the city sits on and around quite a significant geothermal energy resource. We then looked at the components that actually go to make up the renewable energy resource. And looking at renewable gases, we found, this is agriculture and forestry. We drew a circumference of 250 kilometers. This is so that we did this on the proximity principle. We didn't want to be the cause of renewable energy projects being built way out west, only to increase people's energy bills through transmission and distribution networks. So it was important to keep this close to the city. And we found that this represents a significant resource. The sort of orange to red is the most dense resource, and this gives you how much contribution it would make to the target and how much contribution it would make to reducing CO2 emissions. Existing biofuels, I'll run through these quickly as the computer's a bit slow. And again, the red areas represent where that resource. Horticultural waste and livestock manure, huge resource. And finally, our sort of waste and sewage resource is quite significant as well. And when we're looking at waste, we're not just looking within the city, we have our own waste to deal with, but there's also potential resource out there. And you can see that the artificial line of 125 kilometre radius, we can draw that further out to gather in more renewable resources. This is renewable electricity, and what this is showing us at the moment, that 55% of this can be provided on site, but 45% will need to be provided off site, again on the proximity principle. Renewable gases, a substantial contribution there. Something like 95% of that target within the 250 kilometre area. When we put those both together, we find that at the moment, renewable gases makes up more than half, and the rough split between on-site and off-site renewable electricity. Again, on renewable gases, we can just simply draw that line further out to gather that more in. Natural gas is the transitional stage for us. The issue is developing a renewable gas market, getting that connection between the city and the country that was always there from the original first colony. These renewable gases can be generated in rural locations. The water recovered from that can be used by that rural community for further growing of food and so on. and the gas can be shipped into the city in the form of liquid gas. This is what we did in London. Funnily enough, one of the first projects wasn't far from where I lived in the Surrey Hills. And this shows you what you can do with 100,000 tonnes of waste. And you can pretty much avoid something like 98% going to landfill if you make use of all the different resources. Energy, water, and also the inert aggregate that can be used for construction. Now, the liquefaction technology is a small-scale version of liquefied natural gas, and this is near Newlands Corner, for those of you that know the Surrey area. This is actually in eyesight of Newlands Corner, but you can't actually see it. It's surrounded by trees. This previously was a remote landfill gas site that flared its gas at night time, and that's now nowhere near an electricity or gas grid. That is now liquefied and transported into London, and the first market for that was for running large vehicles, buses, lorries, and as you see here, a supermarket lorry as well. And so we covered tri-generation renewable energy, and we covered alternative waste treatment. This is what we're currently working on at the moment, a citywide non-potable recycled water network. At the moment, you dig holes in the ground, hope that it rains, treat all water to drinking water standards, pipe it into the city, and then drink 2% of it. By far, the greatest use of water is for non-drinking purposes. So this is what this is about. Major project just starting over at Sydney Park, and we're looking to join up all these different water recycling systems. Perhaps the last, and for some, the most interesting, automated waste collection, because this is very new to Australia. This is in every continent around the world, with the exception in Australia, so Sydney will be the first. Originally developed in Stockholm in Sweden back in 1975, but perhaps the largest system is Barcelona. 80% of its waste is collected in this way. Can be retrofitted in a city, existing buildings, as well as new development, high-rise tower blocks. You have a pipe network system that seamlessly takes this waste down, and also in the street litter bins out in the street. And essentially what it does is that it sucks waste in at about 70 kilometres per hour. You can segregate the waste into recyclables and mixed waste, however that waste comes. You just simply put it a bit like a washing machine door, in it goes. That gradually stacks up. We can use a single pipe system. It's computer controlled, so we can take different sorts of waste at different times of the day. Following the tri-generation routes, that's sucked down to a receiving station in the green transformer location, and that can be stored up. Now, what that does, although this uses some energy to do this, what we're avoiding is the huge amounts of fuel that's needed to run garbage trucks around the city, early hours of the morning, clanging and banging. We can put these in particular locations and just collect them seamlessly at a single location. We don't send trucks around a city to pick up people's sewage. We quite readily accept that our sewage just disappears in a pipe under the ground. It's just infrastructure. This is just moving on. This is moving waste and garbage into the 21st century, and that gives us a resource that enables us to recover that and convert that into renewable gases, water, and also construction materials. Now, the City of Sydney has not been standing still. It's moved forward with its own projects. We've already reduced emissions by 17% in a lot less than the last couple of years. We've currently got going for a procurement exercise to build in another 23% reduction in carbon emissions, and that's been out for expressions of interest, and we're currently evaluating those, and we'll be going out to tender shortly on that. Similarly with tri-generation, that's a tender that's currently underway at the moment. That's due to be returned at the end of January. We've done 18 renewable energy projects already, including Sydney Town Hall. LED lighting, the city has 8,500 street lighting columns. It's currently trialling 250 of those in and around places like Martin Place and some of the parks. And the best ones are showing a 53% reduction in energy consumption compared to the previous use of street lighting. Automated waste, we're looking to have a demonstration project up and running within the next year or so. Transport, you've heard about, not just cycleways, but also alternative fuel transport, including electric vehicles. So when we look at what the city's doing, the tri-generation project, we've put, these are the 7 main sites, but we've actually put all 200 of the city's buildings into that tender to maximise the scope of tri-generation for tenderers. It's an output specification, so we're not telling them how to do it. We've given them all the information for the best tenderer to come back with the best project at the best price. We've also, through that process, as you heard earlier this evening, are seeking expressions of interest for the establishment of a citywide ESCO, a public-private joint venture company similar to what I established in Woking and in London. So come the end of January, we'll be in a better position to know how that goes. That project is designed to roll out the 360 megawatts of the Tri-Generation Master Plan. So if you like, we've already got that procurement process underway whilst the Tri-Generation Master Plan is being finalised. Photovoltaics, some of you will have seen these around the Surrey Hills, Redfern and so on. When I looked at what the city was doing when I came here, they were spending about $2 million a year on just purchasing green power. And could we put that to better effect by reinvesting that on renewable energy projects on the city's own buildings and operations? So a policy change was made earlier this year to develop this renewable energy fund. The first tranche of that will be a $12 million renewable energy fund for photovoltaics, and that's also been out for expressions of interest, and we're currently evaluating those, and we'll be going out to tender on those. And that will deliver in the order of something like 2,000 kilowatts of photovoltaics. And that just shows you the huge difference you can make by a simple policy change. And some of the projects that have included in that tendering process, Ian Thorpe Aquatic Centre, Redfern Oval, Railway Square, that can be retrofitted with glass photovoltaics, so providing solar shading as well as solar electricity. And the top of Town Hall House and potentially a small phase 2 project at Sydney Town Hall. Something like 35 different buildings across the city. And that's been deliberate so that people, when they move around the city, can see that it's happening. There's nothing like stimulating people to take action in their own home or their own business by the local authority showing by doing. As I mentioned before, electric vehicles. We had the first charging point here. We've now got the first Mitsubishi electric vehicles, and we're trialling those out. The key thing about electric vehicles is not the vehicle itself. We think they'll perform. It's about the infrastructure. These will take electricity. We need to know how much electricity. We need to know how much renewable energy we need to increase our target by to keep that generally zero emissions. So, 70% of Sydney's carbon emissions can be cut by 2030. And when we look at that big target, we then see what would the city look like in 2030. Well, renewable energy could be providing 30% of that energy needs, both in the seas and on land, using advanced technologies that will be commercially viable by 2030, like wave power systems like this. And moving on to land, using buildings to generate renewable energy, such as photovoltaics and micro wind turbines. And of course, the Sydney Town Hall was the first to do that. The most difficult project was a heritage-listed building. And so we had to go through a few hurdles just to get that project done. Other projects should be a lot easier than this. That will work in combination with what goes on under the streets, Tri-Generation. And as you'll see, this is genuine green infrastructure, heating, cooling, electricity. And with that will go the automated waste connection systems and also the recycled water system. And that will gradually build out around the city, so by 2030, 70% of energy needs comes from low carbon electricity, from Tri-Generation zero carbon heating and cooling, and 30% from renewable electricity. However, by 2030, we should have displaced natural gas with renewable gas, so it's quite important for us to develop this renewable gases market and to make Sydney potentially 100% renewable energy, 100% carbon free. Thank you.